Hello and welcome to the First Thursday Club for November. Today we're going to be hearing about ESG and the building momentum in construction. And unusually for us, we have three presenters today. We have Jenny Hughes, James Morgan and Emma Reeves, who I'll introduce in a moment. But first we'll do some housekeeping. Quite a few of you have probably been on these before, but for those of you who haven't, we will be muting all the microphones for obvious reasons, but we still want to hear from you. We'd like to hear your questions, and there is a question dialogue box with the software here, so please pop in questions as the presenters are talking. I'll filter those through and we can have a bit of a Q&A at the end. The final thing to say is that we'll send out a questionnaire afterwards, and it helps us with your feedback to sort of tweak how we do these things in the future. So our speakers today, we have Jenny Hughes, who joined Nature Positive as a sustainability management consultant this summer. Jenny's got 10 years experience delivering built environment projects and advising clients on their sustainability journeys. Previous construction related schemes range from urban regeneration projects to link roads and offshore wind farms. Joining Jenny is James Morgan. He's a director from Nature Positive. He's got over 25 years experience pulling together cross-disciplinary expert teams to unlock and deliver often complex and high-profile construction projects. His technical background is in carbon management, sustainability and development. And finally, we have Emma Reeves, who works for Balfour Beatty UK Construction Services. And they support and build civil projects in England and Wales, from project inception through to the end of construction and beyond. During all phases, there is a drive to look for design opportunities to create net zero carbon, increasing the biodiversity and identifying local drivers for delivering social value on the projects Balfour Beatty delivers. So, no further ado, I'll hand over to Jenny.
Great. Thanks, Tim. We're just going to turn our cameras off. So hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today, and in particular, thank you to Emma for joining our webinar. In the next 25 minutes or so, we're going to give an overview of environmental, social and governance issues, why it matters for absolutely everyone on this call, and what are some of the current challenges and opportunities facing contractors. We'll start with some brief background on the concepts of sustainability and ESG, what it means for construction, and then we'll run through some brief examples for each of the areas, starting off with governance, then talking about the environment, and finally ending on social value. We're looking forward to the Q&A, so as Tim says, please do post your questions in the chat box, and we'll come back to those at the end. So what does sustainability and ESG mean? Put simply, sustainability is a societal goal that broadly aims for humans to safely coexist on planet Earth for the long term, and that's not just getting by for the next few hundred years. The concept became very mainstream when, in 1987, the United Nations Brundtland Commission coined sustainability as meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And sustainability is very well known as a three-pillared concept, where decisions and projects need to balance social, environmental, and economic considerations. And this is sometimes also referred to as the triple bottom line, or 3 Ps. But what are under those big headings for businesses? What are the key issues for businesses to consider? That's where I think ESG comes in and is a really helpful concept. This model on screen shows key ESG topics for the construction sector against the 3 pillars of sustainability. You'll notice that good governance is at the heart of the model, and it's crucial for success in all of these areas. Originally, ESG was developed as a concept for the financial sector. However, it's since spread and is now relevant for all businesses. It's worth noting that ESG is narrower than sustainability. It sets specific criteria that businesses need to report against for environmental, social, and governance issues. I'm just going to point out a few key topics and what's important in construction. In the top right-hand corner, we've got environmental topics. Key ones include greenhouse gas emissions. What are you doing to measure and reduce your climate impacts? For construction, pollution risks are an important consideration. Is there air pollution or dust impacts from projects? Is there potential to impact on watercourses? And how is your business more generally meeting environmental laws and requirements? Under the economic heading, topics include profitability, which is really important. And what's the investment model or budget for your projects? How are you managing risks, for example, inflation? And looking further beyond your own organisation, how are you preventing corruption, for example, in your supply chains? Under the heading of social, one of the key topics which has increased in focus in the last few years is equality, diversity and inclusion. How are you approaching your recruitment to be inclusive? How's your company tackling biases, promoting gender and broader equality? What are the impacts of your project on communities? Are they positive or are they negative? And how are you managing or improving those? Are you creating good jobs and spending money in your supply chains? So that's a quick overview of some key ESG topics for construction. One of the reasons ESG is such importance is because companies are now having to report and disclose their ESG impacts. Deloitte put this very handy summary together. There's a lot of detail, but I'm just going to draw attention to a few parts. On the left-hand side, there's examples of more traditional accounting standards. Those standards dictate what businesses have to report in their financial statements. Organizations are required to report on material financial issues. Material issues are risks that are significant to the business because they have a big impact on turnover or profits. Businesses should be reporting on environmental, social, and economic issues, but arguably the environmental and social ones have not had quite enough focus in the last few years. Looking at the green arrow, the key trend to be aware of is a move towards double materiality. Businesses not only need to report what are material issues for their business, but they also then have to report how your business is impacting the external world. For example, what's your company impact on climate and nature? We're going to talk about a few of these standards a bit later, but I want to draw attention to the top right icon, the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, the Sustainable Development Goals are arguably a bit less dry and more accessible than corporate reporting standards for everyone on this call, and every single one of us can play a role in our business to contribute to these goals. The United Nations developed the Sustainable Development Goals back in 2015, and they were adopted by all countries to provide a blueprint for a peaceful, prosperous future for people and planet. We're trying to meet these goals by 2030, so we've only got 8 years left. And there are some pretty big ambitions for these 17 goals, including goal number 1, no poverty, goal 3, good health and well-being across the planet, goal 11, sustainable cities and communities, and goal 15, life on land. A crucial point to emphasize, particularly at the time when world leaders are assembling in Egypt for COP27, is that a stable biosphere and climate is absolutely fundamental to achieve any of the goals above. So that's those 4 goals at the bottom. We really need to focus on those. Businesses can use the goals to target their efforts. And we at Nature to Positive developed an SDG tool to help companies assess where they are in their journey and help look at where they can go next. Pass back to James.
Thanks, Jenny, and good afternoon, everyone. So I suppose the first thing to say, without pointing out the too obvious, is that the construction sector is huge. It's multifaceted and therefore it's critically important. It delivers our housing, healthcare, education, employment, transport, utilities, defence and sanitation needs. It underpins our fresh water, our food supply, the stuff we buy, the energy we need, and all the infrastructure required to get that to us. You get the picture, it's linked to almost everything. And globally, we are a growing population, heading towards 10.4 billion by the end of the century. And so perhaps unsurprisingly, global construction output is expected to grow by 42% between 2020 and 2030 to reach US dollars 15.2 trillion. And in terms of carbon alone, the construction sector globally accounts for 39% of energy and process-related carbon emissions. And you can see some of the UK headline figures there from the IPA's 2021 analysis of the National Infrastructure and Construction Pipeline in terms of predicted spend, associated employment figures for the sector, and the number of upcoming UK projects. So it's vitally important to society and to economy, and in turn it has significant impact on the environment of available resources and ecosystems. Next slide, please, Jenny. So because the sector is so important, there is a raft of policy and papers and legislation to drive behaviours and to stimulate continuous improvement. A few of these are shown on the right-hand side of the screen and broadly fall into 2 camps. how to better deliver complex construction projects, and from an appraisal and evaluation perspective, how do we judge what good looks like? Getting this right has therefore been a long focus of industry leaders, trade associations, governments, and academia, and has led to the development of sector models that promote frameworks for managers and projects teams to realize these improvements. Examples include Project 13 Enterprise Model, the Construction Playbook, a systems approach to infrastructure delivery, both in 2020 and most recently in 2022, a highly recommended paper. Common phrases are identifying the best athletes from the right project stage and agile leadership, getting it right first time, thinking in terms of outcomes, not edifices, asking not if is it shovel ready, but is it shovel worthy? And in terms of appraisal and evaluation, there are papers like the Treasury's Green Book, which aims to ensure that projects are first and foremost assessed in terms of their contribution to the overall net zero target, and Procuring for Value, which aims to improve productivity and end user satisfaction. Now, we can pick some of these up at the end if anyone has any questions, but Jenny, I think you wanted to say a headline or two in terms of upcoming legislation.
Thanks, James. Yeah, so at the national level, we've tried to include some of the key pieces of legislation which are important for the construction sector. Hopefully, lots of you on the call, they'll be familiar to you. The Social Value Act was passed in 2012. Last year, we enshrined a new target to cut carbon emissions by 78% by 2035, so more ambitious. The Environment Act achieved royal assent last year, and the building regulations have had amendments this year. So really what we're seeing is legislation evolving year on year to require better performance in relation to ESG and sustainability. At the top, just want to draw attention to the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. That's a piece of EU legislation. It's due to be enacted this year, and it affects businesses. Companies are going to have to submit their reports by January 2025 for the previous year. Seems like quite a long time away, but it's only 2 years away. Companies affected include large companies with over 40 million euros turnover and listed companies on EU regulated markets. And companies are going to need to report on wider topics than they've previously done, including environmental protection, social responsibility, respect for human rights, anti-corruption and bribery, and diversity on company boards. And companies need to report not only on policy and the outcomes of policy, but also on risks and KPIs. So it's not going to be a tick box exercise. So we've talked a lot about requirements, regulations, and companies being challenged to do the right thing. But most importantly, there's loads of benefits to businesses of having strong ESG or sustainability strategies and performance. We've summarized some of the key benefits on the screen. There's quite a lot of words, there's quite a lot of benefits. And we've talked about benefits for businesses and at the project level, but there are, of course, crossovers. So strong ESG ratings can actually enable companies to get lower interest rates on their loans. And this in itself can help create competitor advantage. You can realize cost and efficiency benefits from looking at your sustainability risks and opportunities. There's potential for less legal or court costs and fewer delays and rework on construction projects. And ultimately, upfront investment leads to better outcomes for people, planet, and long-term profits. On the top right-hand side, at project level, an interesting one is that as well as moral and ethical reasons for treating all people equally and fairly, greater diversity in the workforce has been shown to improve problem solving and resilience. At the project level, you can also reduce your risks in the supply chain, and you can improve stakeholder relations and enhance staff well-being and retention.
Thanks, Jenny. Next slide, please. So there's nothing quite like talking governance to wake up an audience on a Thursday afternoon. And so when we look at different elements of ESG, we typically think of the environmental and social issues as being things that we deal with at the coalface, where we have a regulatory requirements to undertake EIAs or HIAs, or need to measure or meet framework KPIs or design mitigation measures, for example. But the direction of travel is for these aspects to be considered at the organizational level too. We now need to look at our own impacts, which goes much further than at the project level. We need to start considering our whole value chain. More on this later. And so increasingly, the approach of a given company towards its governance really sets the overall tone for the business in terms of its values, its ethos, and its cultures, and critically, the way in which it's perceived, both from its internal and external clients, markets, and potential investors. So governance is a set of rules, processes, and best practices by which an organisation or a project is managed. And you can see on the screen there some of the bullet points. I'm not going to run through all of those, but I suppose most prominent are leadership, clear organisational structure and project board, clear lines of responsibility, robustness and transparency, and of course, compliance with standards. The danger is that when we think of governance, we think of this as something that's head office thing. It gets lost in the noise of the other sustainable buzzwords, signing up to the right accord, joining the right clubs, or just ticking the right boxes. So how do we make sure that projects are running responsibly? Next slide, please, Jenny. This diagram that we developed with a contractor to identify a continuous improvement approach to delivering a typical construction projects. This in terms of overall efficiency and all the things you need to consider, but it's particularly relevant to ESG. Inside the oval, you will see the phases of a construction project moving from left to right, and it aims to show that at different services and expertise is required at specific stages of the projects and of the process. We call this approach one team, which means that equitable representation from the key stakeholders, which is what Jenny was talking about earlier. You need to have the right voices from the client, the contractor, the designer, the key supply chain SMEs, and from procurement and legal and other stakeholders, all with the right voice if we're going to look and focus on outcomes. The point here is that at each stage of the project is completely bespoke. Each project is completely bespoke to the geographical area in which it is, and accordingly, the ESG activity and considerations need to be focused in that particular area. I'm very conscious we've got Emma online, who's actually going to talk to you about a contracted construction company, Balfour Beatty's approach to governance. Next slide, please, Jenny.
Hi, Emma, can you hear us? Just to say we can't hear you if your microphone's on.
Okay, well, I'll take that to mean that Emma's having some problems. Shall I talk through this one, Jenny, quickly?
Yeah.
Okay, so Balfour Beatty have put the government strand, their sustainability, right at the very heart of their strategy, and in 2020 made sustainability one of their core values, and I think that's really telling. So they looked at it from in terms of being we're lean, we're expert, we're trusted, we're safe, and we're more sustainable. And they have a very clear involvement right from the very top, from the Safety and Sustainability Committee into the Executive Committee, business units, internal and external audits. Next slide, please, Jenny. So as Jenny mentioned in the introduction, there is obviously a whole range of considerations under the environment bit of ESG. But for time purposes and purposes of the topics here, we are focusing on biodiversity and becoming nature positive because it underpins everything. And actually, it doesn't really matter what else we do if we don't get this bit back, get this bit right. Next slide, please, Jenny. So what do we mean when we say biodiversity? Biodiversity refers to the variety of life on Earth, including everything from bacteria to all species of animals and plants and the genetic diversity within each species. The interactions between species, known as ecosystems, are complex, but from these interactions, we derive all the goods and services that sustain human life. Next slide, please, Jenny. Thank you. So what do we mean? So let's think about what we mean when we say natural services underpin all. This diagram may be helpful. I'm not going to go into great detail, but broadly, there are 4 key services: provisioning, supporting, cultural, and regulating. And they show the depth and reach into our core businesses and our supply chains that natural services provide. In the case of the construction sector, provisioning and regulatory are perhaps the most obviously impactful, but one could easily argue that all are important. And for those catching up, it is now widely recognized that over half of the world's GDP, $44 trillion, moderately or highly depend on nature and its services. And depending on who you talk to, this could be more like 100%. That's an extraordinary figure, and I'll repeat that. Over half of the world's GDP is moderately to highly reliant on nature. Similarly, the penny is dropping that biologically diverse ecosystems can provide up to 37% of carbon emissions reductions needed to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. So what are businesses doing about this? Next slide, please, Jenny. In November 2021, Nature Positive carried out an analysis of the FTSE 100 companies to understand what they are doing about biodiversity. More than half made no mention of biodiversity or only mentioned it in passing or indirectly, and therefore they have no understanding of the impacts their business has on the biodiversity, or even more importantly, or as importantly, how they rely upon it. We found that sectors that were performing well tended to be those who either had a very obvious relationship with biodiversity or those that were under some form of regulation, such as the estates or real estate biz sector or construction, because of the government's mandatory biodiversity net gain requirement. However, this year is seeing a seismic shift. Next slide, please, Jenny. In a few weeks' time, COP15, the biodiversity equivalent of COP26, will take place in Montreal, where world leaders will seek to agree a new set of global goals to protect nature as clear and measurable as those on climate. In the same way as COP26 raised the bar on what businesses are doing to meet net zero, COP15 is set to have a similar impact in terms of shining a light on what they're doing to safeguard nature. Investors and clients will be watching what companies are doing for biodiversity in the same way as they have done on emissions. Last month at a pre-COP15 meeting, the UK introduced a 10-point plan for financing biodiversity. This outlines the intention that businesses should assess and disclose their nature-related risks and dependencies and set quantitative targets to not only reduce negative impacts, but increase positive impacts. And it commits governments to develop the appropriate regulatory and policy frameworks to facilitate this. At the Natural Capital Summit held in October, we were blown away by the number of the Tier 1 investors, developers, construction companies, and pension funds all in attendance, and all putting biodiversity at the very center of their investment decisions. They understand the risk, and when investors are starting to talk about risk, we can expect to see knock-ons throughout industry. And weekly, we are hearing of businesses like Balfour Beatty and indeed RSK who are securing unrivaled investment from sustainability-linked loans. I'll now hand you back to Jenny, who will discuss some next steps.
Thanks, James. So what can contractors and construction companies do? We're currently working with companies in the sector and following these steps you see on screen on how they can work towards being nature positive. The first step is it's absolutely crucial to assess the risks to your business based on how you rely on biodiversity across your value chain. We'd look at key products. For example, timber. Where are your timber products coming from? How are your forests managed? Are there risks because they're near to ecologically sensitive areas? Do key products have biosphere impacts because they're very water or energy intensive to produce, for example, concrete? Next step would be to understand the impacts and map your value chain. We'd look at biodiversity issues across your value chain and undertake hotspot analysis, looking at issues such as, does the extraction or processing of key raw materials require significant water use? Are there hazardous byproducts from their production? The next step would be to define targets and develop your mitigation and compensation action plans. As James mentioned, this should be about making positive impacts, so it's not just about businesses reducing negative ones. Actions that you could take could include providing information and support to your supply chain partners to help them switch to more sustainable sources, and advising your customers on the safe disposal of products. Setting targets could look like reducing activities causing deforestation or conversion of virgin forests in your supply chain, and avoid sourcing from areas of high species extinction risk. Your targets, of course, need to be smart and clear, and most importantly, you then need to deliver your actions, monitor your progress, and disclose the results. Finally, I'm now just going to talk for a short while about social value and principles for embedding and delivering it through construction projects. The Social Value Act was enacted in 2012 and requires public authorities to consider social value in their public service contracts. I've included a built environment definition on the screen in the top right, and social value relates to how buildings, places, and infrastructure support environmental, economic, and social well-being. It's now being seen as a clear contract requirement from government and local authorities, and tenders are sometimes rating social value up to 20%. This diagram shows lots of examples of how businesses can deliver social value and hopefully brings to life a little bit about what it means. It's about how you directly employ people, spend money, develop skills. It could be related to CSR activities and how you work with your procurement and supply chain. Almost most importantly, social value should be at the heart of the purpose and design of your project. If it's a link road, is it really providing public active travel routes? Is it reducing transport by high emission vehicles? Is the building designed for people to use and to live in? To maximize social value, you really need to be thinking about these considerations as early on as possible in the project. So lots of people start understanding the concept of social value, but they're less aware of how you should be delivering it through projects. This slide summarizes the process. You might see some parallels between the last set of steps we outlined for looking at biodiversity. A key point for social value is that there's no blueprint for it. It's really crucial that you develop specific priorities based on the local area. It's got to be relevant for local communities and the environmental context. First step is really understanding the needs and priorities. You need to look at stakeholders, demographic data, engage and consult with people, and then you can move on to developing clear, meaningful priorities for that scheme. As you deliver it, it's crucial to manage and measure how it's progressing, and finally, obviously, to monitor and improve. You need to be adaptable as well, and you may need to revisit this as you move through the life cycle of the project. So that was a really quick introduction to the concept. It's now 10 years on from the Social Value Act being passed, and this slide summarizes some of the key current challenges and opportunities facing contractors. I would argue that there's a danger of an overemphasis on quantitative and monetized data and measuring this. I think that potentially stifles innovation, and we need to always remember what social value is really about. It's about improving lives. Contractors could face a challenge of having proportionate but inclusive engagement with communities. And I still think that there's a potential challenge around accountability and having the right people involved and leading on this at the project level. The concept's still relatively new, so although awareness has grown hugely, I think there still needs to be some upskilling and improving on resources for delivery. There's lots of opportunities though, and I think a key one is that digital tools and apps can help optimize measuring and monitoring and engage people in the process. You can improve stakeholder relations through delivering social value, and you can also improve your talent pipeline and recruitment in local areas. So James and I have given a very quick overview of ESG and sustainability, what it means for contractors. We've talked through current challenges in relation to governance, biodiversity, and delivering social value. We've created a summary and a SWOT analysis of how we think the construction sector is doing, and I'll draw out a few key points to sum up. The strengths are that for most companies, they've set targets around climate change, waste, social value, and EDI, and there's relatively good progress on carbon and climate change, with net zero targets for operations and lots of action around embodied and construction carbon. There's opportunities around biosphere protection and enhancement. And there's also the opportunity to lead in relation to waste and enabling the circular economy. A potential weakness is currently not looking beyond site and direct impacts on nature. And value is often realized by the built environment, but it's not always being captured and measured, so lessons learned are not always being passed on. A potential challenge or threat is the speed at which climate change and environmental sustainability actions are needed. We're also facing a cost of living crisis, and costs of materials are increasing. And it's likely that evidence of past performance becomes a procurement requirement for social value. Those are a few of the key strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And I just want to sum up to end on a sort of positive point, because we've talked about a lot of complex issues today, but at its heart, sustainability and ESG is really about people and businesses having an ongoing commitment to doing better. Thank you for listening, and we're looking forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Jenny and James, and apologies that we seem to lose Emma in amongst that. She was having issues with her connection, so I'm not sure if she'll join us for the questions, but if not, I'm sure Jenny and James can field these questions, of which we have a few. I think the first one, I'm not quite sure whether this is one for Jenny or James, or maybe both of you, but it's around the idea that biodiversity and the issues around biodiversity are essentially the next carbon, that we're a lot further down the line with regards to reduction in carbon, and tier one contractors and other big corporations are aware of their impact from carbon. But biodiversity, my feeling is, it's quite a new word for a lot of these people, obviously not for us that have been in the industry, but do you feel that this is going to follow a similar trajectory, or does it need to be accelerated?
Shall I take that one? Oh, both offering. James, you can go first.
Well, I'll give it a go, Jenny, and then you can clean it up. Yeah, so if you look back at the sort of the short answer to your question, Tim, is yes, I think absolutely, and increasingly biodiversity ecosystems are linked to carbon anyway. I really do feel that it feels very similar, and the early days and the sounds that are being made from particularly investors and companies in development and construction companies are very much the same. So I guess the question is, what lessons, what would we have done differently with hindsight? What were the sticking points? How do we get there much quicker with biodiversity? And actually we can see with carbon, just as health and safety is embedded, it's in everything that we do now. So what are the low-hanging fruit? What do we immediately and directly can we influence? How does that come from our supply chain? And perhaps even more, or just as just business continuity in its own right. How are we exposed to it in terms of materials? And if you look at your clients, both existing and future, I think it's if you want to get, for example, if you're a construction company, you want to get on a public sector framework, what are your KPIs and your governance and your performance in and around biodiversity? Will you even get on those frameworks in the future if you haven't got your ducks in a row? And similarly, that in terms of attracting investments. And if you are in sectors, what are their attitudes to this? And if yours don't align, are you at risk therefore of not working in that sector? Are you? So it's a very long-winded way of saying, but yeah, absolutely, Tim, I think it is. Jenny.
I think what I would add is, I think it's going to follow a similar trajectory, but we absolutely need accelerated action. And there's going to be so many lessons learned from carbon that we can almost apply as a blueprint to nature and biodiversity. And we're seeing that through the replication and mirroring of the TCFD, so that's the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. That's being directly mirrored in the TNFD. That's really helpful because it provides a consistent approach for businesses to look at this. But one reflection, and this is from I was at a conference in London earlier this year, and they were still very much focused on carbon and climate change. It was only this year I felt that people had really got to grips with how to explain it very accessibly. And we really need to make sure the same mistake is not made for nature. Because sometimes otherwise what you end up doing is talking at the high level. People on the ground in their day jobs, they really struggle to think, what's the action I can do? So that's what we need to make sure we're focusing on. And that's where I think the parallel with health and safety comes in, making it a part of everyday work for everyone.
Thank you. It's probably as a bit of an addition to that would be, I wonder if you have comments on how the two are interrelated. We talked there about carbon and biodiversity or nature in sort of in silos, and the TNFD and TCFD obviously sort of are individual things concentrating on carbon and nature. But I wonder if you could expand on the connection between carbon and nature, the fact that probably you can't really deal with one without the other, and the benefits to reducing carbon could be nature benefits and vice versa.
Well, I think one really simple way is talking about level of resource use. If you're reducing your material use, you're reducing your carbon. You're also then reducing your material extraction, which could have an impact on nature. That's one really clear, simple way of showing the parallels and the links. James, I don't know if you want to add any other examples.
I guess from a reporting perspective, Tim, that TCFD and TNFD ultimately will be reporting them all together as one, and they will be interlinked. And I think it is a concern that they're being treated separately at the moment. But I think in time now, I think there's also one for social as well, isn't there? Is it if I did, Jenny? Or...
Yeah. There's a new task force around inequality. But one other thing which I did want to mention we haven't talked today is about the word nature-based solutions. And that's obviously a very clear way in which you show that carbon and biodiversity is linked. Nature-based solutions can be delivered to increase carbon sequestration. They can also be delivered to help improve adaptation to climate. And nature-based solutions in their name are obviously about improving, enhancing biodiversity and ecosystems as well.
I was wondering if you could give us an example of that, Jenny, just to people that are the uninitiated of nature-based solutions and how they could help with that.
Of course. Okay, so say in the water sector, I know there's a lot of discussion around improving habitats in upland areas and how trees can help capture water and prevent quick runoff, which would reduce flood risk downstream.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. I've got here a question that says, what are the advantages for tier 1 contractors to be proactive about this as opposed to reacting to legislation changes? I guess that the wider piece of, you know, why do we have to do anything now? Why not wait until we're forced to by the law or operating policies or whatever, or licenses to operate?
Yeah, so I think it links back to, you know, if you look at the Balfour Beatty governance and other governance, that are looking at materiality assessments, what's important to their clients, and you know, biodiversity is right up there. And if we think that we're going to focus on outcomes rather than edifices in the contractor and tier 1, as increasingly we are in a systems approach, how does it fit in? You know, things like the biodiversity net gain, the legislation there, is such something that developers and contractors and others are just going to have to do. And in the end, that won't, you know, that will just become a common denominator, right? Everyone will have to do it, so therefore you're not differentiating yourself. And just as you do in carbon, or as you do in option engineering, or all the other things you have to think about on a construction projects in terms of how you're going to be clever around program, not getting your ducks in a row straight around biodiversity, nature-based solutions, and other ESG issues potentially hold up your project massively. They make them irrelevant, and so therefore the company that can be perceived and genuinely embed the right approaches to this will win more work, will get that reputation, will be the company that people want to work for, their staff will want to stay. So there's this huge knock-on impacts, and you know, particularly when you look at graduates and apprentices as we have, to look what's important to them. You know, the climate change, the environment is right up there, and they want to be seen to be, and they want to work for companies that are being seen to and actually are delivering projects against that with meaning. So if we will recognize we have a resource issue across this sector, you know, it's important, I think, to get this right. Over and above just because it's right, but you know, ultimately these stuff, if we don't get it right, there will be no business for us all in which to work anyway. That was a bit, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Not at all. I'm slightly smiling because one of the questions I was going to ask is sort of linked to this, and I think you've sort of probably answered it, but I'll say it anyway. But he says you've made an excellent case for why ESG is important to all of us and to a certain extent businesses, but does it not always come down to profits? This will be a system that simply costs.
I think it's a good point because that's the way that people have thought traditionally. But if we come back to one of the main points we're trying to make in this presentation, there's no point in having a profit if your business is going to be unsustainable in the long term, because we're not going to have a planet to live on that's livable. and not only that, but you know that we're facing huge social challenges as well. So yeah, I think we need to keep getting that message across to people.
Sure.
I think as well, you know, when you look at things from a sustainable perspective, it's about using less stuff. It's about being smart about the materials you know that you're using, the training you give your people, the representation you have at strategic board level. It all filters down ultimately to profit. I guess the challenge is the gap between senior teams saying that and then seeing the profit in reality on a project by project basis, which is why, you know, as we were saying earlier, getting your procurement and legal and your QS teams involved in this right from the very beginning is really, really important.
We also know that sustainable technologies, the costs are coming down hugely. You've seen the incredible kind of cost curve reduction of renewable energy technologies and how they're actually cheaper, arguably, on a megawatt basis now compared with other fossil fuels. So there's good examples like that where it's related to profit. Good to be sustainable.
Okay, I'm sort of conscious time. I think we'll probably have one more question. There's a few others, but just to reassure people that are popping questions in here, the guys will send a copy of that and transcripts and your emails, and we'll be able to directly come back to you on the ones we haven't managed to get around to. The final one there is, where do you start when the construction industry, or sorry, sector needs a certain quantity of raw materials and substitutes are not available?
Oh. That's a good question.
Difficult question. Well, I think that, I mean, sometimes when you're talking about certain raw materials, that comes back to the bigger question at a national level in terms of climate change, biodiversity. How are we balancing our national accounts? So obviously we've got a target of meeting net zero by a certain year. We need to balance that between, okay, which sectors really do need to keep using certain materials for now? Which ones do we need to decarbonize quicker? So I think it does need to be considered in the round.
Any points on that, James?
So this is you broke up just in the key bit of the question there, Tim. That was around the
Convenient.
What do we do when materials run out?
No, it's not so much run out. I think it's when the substitutes aren't available. So obviously there's a level of raw materials that are needed in all construction. I mean, presumably concrete's right up there with one.
Yeah.
But you know, the substitutes aren't available. So what do you do about that now?
Absolutely, yeah. Okay, so you know, yeah. I mean, there will be some cases where concrete's, you know, that's what's needed to deliver the project, which is why you need to look at it as a whole, and you need to look at the systems where, you know, so if you can't do it on a particular structure, for example, I don't know, an aqueduct, a viaduct, a tunnel, you don't want to be messing around with low carbon if you're not sure that it's as strong and has the same properties as required. You know, no one's going to recommend building Hinkley Point out of timber frame, for example. So where you need the key infrastructure and you need the materials that we know and are for all sorts of safety reasons need to be in place, that's absolutely right. But that doesn't stop you then considering the other areas in and around that development and impacts, and indeed offsetting opportunities, if that's what is required, to me the thing.
Yeah, I think the broader point there is that there's no silver bullet here. We're on a journey. We're traveling from where we were to where we need to get to, and there, you know, sometimes the substitute won't be available yet. So we're doing as best as we can as we go and offsetting where we need to and so on. There is no perfect solution to this. Okay, thank you. Sorry, Jenny, did you want to jump in there quickly?
No, I was just going to say, and that's where the importance of investing in innovation as well, and trying to come up with creative solutions to these challenges. But yeah, we're going to need a bit of a chuck everything at it approach.
That's fine, and I'm quite positive that we've sort of invented the timber frame nuclear power stations while on the call. So that's good. I think we'll end on that. Thank you very much, and apologies again for Emma's having technical difficulties. It's a real shame. We wanted to hear from her the perspective of Balfour Beatty and a tier 1 contractor, but no doubt she'll get sent any of these questions, and so she'll be able to answer the people that have done so as well. I'm just going to finish off now, just to say that we're running the next First Thursday Club on the 1st of December. It's going to be hosted by our director, Steph Ray, who is going to COP15 in Montreal, but because the first Thursday of December lands on the 1st and the COP starts on the 7th, it's going to be sort of a pre-COP15 presentation entitled "A Fair COP, What Will COP15 Mean for Business?" So we hope to see as many of you as possible there, and feel free to advertise and tell all your colleagues and so on to join us for that. Just a reminder, we'll be sending out the questionnaire after this, and finally, yes, we'll send out the question. We'll answer the questions that have come through we've not managed to get around to today. But thank you again for your attention, and we'll see you next month. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.